With the help of Hashem, we are learning Beitzah Daf Chav Vav. We will begin on Daf Chav Hey Amid Beis, last line by the Mishnah. As we already gave the intro for the Mishnah before we began Daf Chav Hey, that we have to first quickly review the din of a Bechar, a firstborn male offspring from a female domesticated animal, is by birth imbued with the kedusha of Bechor that has two consequences. Firstly, it must be given to a kohen, and secondly, the kohen, as the animal is still unblemished, must be offered as a korban. And shechting the animal outside the Beis HaMikdash is the violation of offering kachim or shechting kachim bachutz. If and when the animal gets blemished, and you have many halachas of what is considered a blemish, it actually has to be considered a permanent blemish, not a passing blemish, then this animal loses its kedushas bechar. It remains the property of the kohen that could be shechted and eaten and used by the kohen as the kohen sees fit. Now, being that a bechar, prior for it being determined to be blemished, cannot be used when there is no Beis HaMikdash at all, it automatically has a status of muktzah. Question is, if there is an animal that as far as we knew, no one ruled it to be blemished, could you paskin on Yom Tiv, can you give a ruling on Yom Tiv that this Bechar is blemished? And by the way, just like nowadays you have people that get smicha, specializing, giving them the authority to paskin in certain areas in halacha, you needed to receive a special smicha to be able to give rulings regarding the status of a bechar, whether it's considered blemished or permanently blemished or not. Now the question of paskining whether a animal is a blemished animal on Yom Tov is really a twofold question. Number one, right, that goes into the big machlekes between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Yehuda has a much broader application of muktzah. If when Shabbos, Yom Tov, Shabbos you can't shecht, but if when Yom Tov comes in, the animal was not yet determined to be, was not yet gepasken to be permanently blemished, then you can argue that this animal has a status of muktzah, and the status remains throughout Yom Tov. That's one issue. Maybe not. Maybe since the animal already had a blemish before Yom Tov, even though no psak was given, one can argue that even according to Rabbi Yehuda, the animal is not considered muktzah if such a determination will be made on Yom Tov. But there is another issue. Also machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, and ironically, even though generally Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, like even regarding muktzah, Rabbi Shimon has the more lenient opinion. In the following machlokes, Rabbi Shimon is the machmer. And that is, Rabbi Shimon is the one that says that such a psak din may not be given on Yom Tov, because everyone agrees to the rule that adjudicating a financial case is prohibited on Yom Tov. The question is, how do you view paskening whether the animal is blemished or not? There is an isur v'heter aspect to it, and as far as isur and heter is concerned, we know that such piskei dinim may be given on Shabbos and on Yom Tov. There's nothing wrong if you have a shayla whether the chicken is kosher or treif to ask that of a rav on Yom Tov. But there is a financial part to it, because prior to it being determined that it's permanently blemished, it belongs to the Beis HaMikdash, it belongs to God. It only becomes property of the kohen if it's determined to be blemished, if you view this, as Rabbi Shimon does, as also at least a financial psak din. Therefore, Rabbi Shimon holds that one may not give such a psak din on Yom Tov. Rabbi Yehuda is lenient and he holds that such a ruling may be rendered on Yom Tov. Now this is the crux of the entire sugya that's going to last for more or less 2 daf. We're going to learn a little bit about Tsar Balachayim, how because of Tsar Balachayim, perhaps one will be allowed to resort to Harama. We're going to learn that Bishitas Rab Shimon, it appears to be that there is a machloikis. It appears to be that even Rab Shimon, who generally paskins, you may not adjudicate whether a bechar is blemished or not, It depends whether the blemish was known prior to Yom Tov or not. Perhaps if the blemish was already known that it was there prior to Yom Tov, even though no psak din was given, it's less problematic. We're going to actually conclude that there is no such a differentiation, that Rab Shimon is always machmed, never allowing a Rav to paskin whether the Bechor is blemished or not. On Daf Chavav Amid Beis, we're going to open up another topic which is related to the whole sugya of the Bechor, and the words are Yesh Muktzah Lachatzi Shabbos or Ein Muktzah Lachatzi Shabbos. Now, when Bein Hashmashos, when Shabbos enters and an item is Muktzah, what do we say? Migo de iskatsoy lebein hashmashos, since it was set away from your mind not to be used during bein hashmashos, it affects its status for the whole Shabbos. We're not speaking about that. What happens if there's an item that when Shabbos came in, it was fit? It was fit, let's say, to be eaten. Something happened during Shabbos which then made it unfit. That changed, and it's now fit again. So there was a period during Shabbos and during Yontif, or during Yontif, where it was muktzah, not in the beginning. Now that status went away. Do we say, since for any time during Shabbos it was muktzah, it remains muktzah for the rest of the Shabbos? That's called Yesh Muktzah, or Yesh Muktzah Lachatzi Shabbos, or Ein Muktzah Lachatzi Shabbos. Bein Hashmashos is different. But if it's not Muktzah Bein Hashmashos, then it's only Muktzah during Shabbos, during the period that it's Muktzah. And that will also go into, God willing, Daf Chav Zayin. Chavra, let us start with the Mishnah again on Daf Chafei, Amid Beis, the last line in the Amid. Says the Mishnah, you have a Bechor that up until now, it was not ruled that it's blemished. But this Bechor that fell into a pit, now the reason why we are mentioning that it fell into a pit, because if the animal's life would not be in danger, generally no one is saying that you should go on Yom Tov and paskin whether this Bechor, whether this animal is a blemished Bechor or not. But now that it's in the pit, now there is an additional pressure. Like Rashi writes in the bottom, V'yarei, there is a fear by the owner, which is a kohen, pen yavusham, it might die there. So says the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda in this machloikis is the lenient one that allows for someone who's qualified to paskin whether the Bechor is considered Bechor with a permanent blemish, and therefore it belongs to the kohen, it's his property. Yered mumcha ve'yira, you may not bring the Bechor out, because as far as we know, maybe the Bechor is not blemished. If the Bechor is not blemished, it's muktzah. You can't move it. So the mumcha has to go down into the pit, and he may examine it, daf chavav on the top, im yesh baimum, and if he determines that it has a blemish, yala v'yishchai tikan shachtet. Now, Chevra, the opinion that holds that you can make such a psak din on Shabbos and on Yom Tov, here we're speaking about Yom Tov because for Shabbos you can't shecht, that's Rabbi Yehuda. The problem is, according to Rabbi Yehuda is generally very machmed when it comes to muktzah. Rabbi Yehuda normally says that if something is muktzah bein hashmashos, it remains muktzah for the entirety of Shabbos or of Yontif. So look inside the top Rashi. Im yesh breimum. First of all, Rashi says al karchach, that the author of the first opinion in the Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda, who allows for a mumcha, for an expert, someone who has smicha, to determine and to paskin whether it's considered a bechor with a mum or not. Problem is, Rabbi Yehuda also is very machman when it comes to muktzah. So therefore Rashi explains, if the case was that we know that whatever we think is a blemish only came to the animal on Yom Tov, but when Yom Tov began, the animal had no blemish, since the lav date ilave me'esmoil, since the person when Yom Tov came in never thought he might even eat the animal because it wasn't blemished, that cannot be the case in a Mishnah. That cannot be the case in a Mishnah. Because even though Rabbi Yehuda will allow for you to make a psak, the mumcha, but it's going to be muktzah. Rabbi Yehuda holds migu, the iskatzoi lebein hashmashos, iskatzoi for the entire Yom Tov. So Rashi limits, the case of the Mishnah must be, v'hachika amar, that the Bechor was already blemished before Yom Tov, but you never had yet the opportunity to show it to a chacham. On Yom Tov, it fell into the pit. Here's where the Mishnah holds, what Rabbi Yehuda holds, that a mumcha can go into the pit. A mumcha is allowed to paskin, and if the mumcha is going to paskin that this animal's blemish is considered halachically a permanent blemish, Rabbi Yehuda will say the animal is no longer muktzah. Why? Because the owner had in mind from before Yom Tov, maybe I will be allowed to eat it. Because the owner was aware of the blemish. You still need to have the psak din of the mumcha, but that knowledge already removes it from migul de iskatzoy de bein hashmoshes. And now Rabbi Yehuda's leniency is that you are allowed to paskin on Yom Tov whether the animal is blemished or not. The imlav, we'll see in the Gemara a nuance in the imlav. But the way we'll begin in the Havamina, the imlav is that the animal was not blemished. There's no such a blemish. Is lo yishcha, then you may not slaughter it. The animal may die. So be it. If it's not blemished, you have to bring it in the Beis Hamikdash. And if you shecht it outside, then it's considered shechting kachim bachutz. Rab Shimon, in our case, regarding are you allowed to paskin, to rule regarding the blemish status of the animal, Rab Shimon says you may not. Rab Shimon oimer kol she'ein mumay nikar. If its blemish was not recognized before Yom Tov, meaning if you didn't already paskin before Yom Tov, mi ba'odyoi means before Yom Tov came in, ein zeh min hamuchan. Amazing. Even though Rab Shimon is generally more lenient when it comes to muktzah application, doesn't help. The animal is not muchan. The animal may not be used. I give such a psak din, you may not give such a psak din, because everyone, like we mentioned, subscribes to the halacha that a beis din is not allowed to adjudicate, to paskin regarding financial matters. And a beis din can paskin. You can go to any rav iser veheter ma'asim b'chol yom. You go to a rav and you ask him a iser veheter shayla, no problem. But this is viewed also as a financial shayla. Prior to amum, belongs to God. If he determines that it's blemished, that it's property of the kohen, and you're not allowed to make such a psak din. Now, does Rab Shimon differentiate between lachatchil and b'di'evid? What happens if they made such a psak din? Does Rab Shimon differentiate between whether the mum was already at least in the animal prior to Yom Tov to whether the mum only came in the animal on Yom Tov? The Mishnah makes no such a mention, but that will be part of the discussion that we will have in the Gemara. Okay, so first, the bigger question is, but Michael Mifligi, what's the underlying machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and Rab Shimon? And nema, if it is, and by the way, it's going to remain that way. Nema, if it's only whether beroyin mumen kol mifligi, the machlokes is whether a mumcha, an expert, who's qualified to paskin whether a bukhar is blemished or not, whether one is allowed to do such a psak din on Yom Tov. That Rabbi Yehuda here is lenient and he holds royin mumen b'Yom Tov. Yes, you are allowed to show a mum to the mumcha. The mumcha may give such a psak din, and Rab Shimon holds ein royin mumen b'Yom Tov. If that's the only machlokes here, then why did we have to speak about a bukhar that fell into a pit? Forget about a pit. Why do you have to mention the pit? And the Gemara is not going to therefore come with a different approach. The Gemara is going to remain that the ikir machlokes is whether royin mumen b'Yom Tov. Do we consider this a financial question, be'ikir, or enough for you not to be allowed to paskin that on Yom Tov? Or do we view this as a iser veheter? And then you are allowed to give such a psak din on Yom Tov. But there is another detail, and that is there's something else. There's another layer by the fact that the bukhar fell into a pit. And now let's begin learning Lishitas Rebbe Yehuda. One would have thought that because of the animal being stuck in the pit, and therefore there is also the aspect of tsar balachayim. And we find elsewhere that subterfuge, ha'arama, tricking the system, sometimes is not allowed. But whenever there's a tsar balachayim question, then we advocate doing ha'arama. Elsewhere, I'll tell you where in a moment elsewhere. So one might think that here, la'arem velaske, even Rabbi Yehuda will allow the animal to be brought up prior to examination by saying, hey, like Rashi spoke out, the animal is known to have a blemish from before Yom Tov. Because if the animal had no blemish, or we did not know about it before Yom Tov, then the whole thing is mute. Because according to Rabbi Yehuda, migo de iskatzoy lebein hashmoshes, iskatzoy for the entire Yom Tov. Oh, so since we know now, we don't have the right to paskin, but since we see that there's a blemish, let us say, because to prevent sar balachayim, we know that the psak din will be the animal is blemished, and therefore we save a moment for the animal, an additional moment for the animal to remain in the pit. Where do we find elsewhere that because of Tzar Balachayim we are allowed to do a ha'arama? Ki Rabbi Yeshua. And like Rashi reminds us, Rabbi Yeshua is later here in Masechtas Beitzah, Masechtas Yom Tov and Daf Lamed Zayin. We know that there is a din, we just read this over Yom Tov, that oisoi ve'es benoi lois ishchatu b'yoyim echad. What happens if two animals fall into a pit, the mother and the child? And according to many, the father and the child. Now, moving an animal stam, you're not allowed to do. You only are allowed to take the animal out because you might eat it. Here, if the mother and the child fell into the pit, then one would say you can only take out one, you can't take out both. Because if you take out one to eat it, says Rabbi Yeshua, no, Tzar Balachayim, don't leave any animal stuck in a pit. Take one animal out by saying, I will eat this one. The moment you take it out, change your mind and say, no, I'm not going to eat, I'm going to eat the other one. And like this, both are out, and then you pick any one you want. So just like we see that to prevent Tzar Balachayim, we can make a harama. So again, one might hold that you are allowed L'Rabbi Yehuda. See, according to Rab Shimon, you can't give such a psak din. But L'Rabbi Yehuda, you can give such a psak din. So why do we even have to call it off? Let's just assume that the animal is already good. So Kamash Malan, no, that's this neat nuance that you can't do. A mumcha can paskin, but the mumcha has to go down. Yeded mumcha v'yir. So now the other question of the Gemara is, since the Mishnah does speak about a pit, the Mishnah should not only speak about whether you could shecht it or whether you cannot shecht it. Since we may not do a ha'arama, we may not even bring it up. So why does the Mishnah only say lo yishchait? Shouldn't have the Mishnah said lo yalavi yishchat nebayalei? So answers the Gemara, there's another nuance in the Mishnah. Again, the main machlokes is whether royin, mumen, or not. But what's the additional nuance? What happens if someone broke the rule of muktzah prior to the psak din, the avar va'askeim? You already brought it out. You already brought it up. So here, salka daita chamina, that since you already brought it up, you can shecht it. Now, why would you think that? We're going to clarify that in a moment. But something happened. Even after you brought it out, you would think lashchite or l'shachate. So that's komash malan, that even if you already brought it out, and the only question is whether you can shecht it or not, so the Mishnah says that lo yishchoit, that's Rabbi Yehuda the Tanach. The Gemara right away counters. Why would you think that just because you broke one rule, you should be allowed to break another rule? The shachate, no. Before the mumcha paskin, the animal is a tam. And a tam, God forbid, shechting kachim bachutz. Loloi. What happened was, loy tzricha the nafal beimuma. The nafal beimuma means, says Rashi, look inside the second Rashi, the second line under the Gemara, that what happened was you have to determine a permanent blemish came to the animal now. Look inside the Rashi. The nafavuma hashta v'hachi kamar only im yesh by mum hakavua me erev yamtiv, then yalav v'yishchait v'im lav, if there wasn't a mum kavua from before yamtiv, tolei hayim yamtiv ela hayoim, even if you brought it up, that's another nuance. Dafke, the way we learned that Rashi in the Mishnah. The Tanach is Rabbi Yehuda, even though the Mishnah does, the Tanach is Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda, who was lenient, allowing a mumcha to paskin regarding a mum, Rabbi Yehuda is machmed regarding muksa. So the Mishnah also wants to let you know that if a mum only developed on Yantiv, even though the mumcha can paskin that this animal is considered an animal with a mum kavua, but now you may not shecht it. Why not? Because it didn't have the mum prior to Yomtiv. Verstehst? And therefore, when Yomtiv came in, Bein Hashmashos, it was muksa, it remains muksa for the entire Yomtiv. Back in the Gemara, let's see, so the Gemara says, if there is a mum, then avade muksa, not even a chiddush, weiter pshita. Elo, what happened was like this: there was a mum over me'erev Yomtiv. And now, v'hashta havale mum kavua, that mum oiver developed into a mum kavua, which means that when Yom Tov came in, there was something there. So the owner didn't completely push the animal out of his mind. There was a certain amount of hope of the owner that maybe the mumcha is going to paskin that this animal is blemished. If that's going to happen, and let Rabbi Yehuda such a psak din may be given, I will be allowed to eat it. So v'date elave, the owner did have in mind. He didn't have in mind vadai. He had in mind suffix. So that's a chiddush. So now the time of the date elave, and therefore v'nishchate. That's the Kumash Malan. So let's read the Mishnah again. Look inside the top line. So number one, Tzar Balachayim doesn't justify bringing the animal out. Rabbi Yehuda holds that a mumcha can paskin on yantiv. Ve'im lav, the top line in the Mishnah, ve'im lav means that if the animal was brought out, which is not kosher, but they did it already. And not only that, but now the mumcha saying that, listen, I'm looking at this mum, I know what happened. Before Yom Tiv, the mum was not yet a mum kavua. But now I know today it became more kavua. So you would think that since the owner had hoped to eat it, it should not be considered muktzah. The Mishnah says, lo yishchait. So there's many nuances, but the ikar machloikis is whether royin mumin or not. And now the Gemara is going to go to a Tanach Rabbanan, and as we will see, according to the Beitzah that we will quote right now, that we will ultimately conclude is not authoritative, we're going to have certain details, bishitas Rab Shimon, all based on what we learned. In other words, now that we clarified that Rabbi Yehuda, there's a difference whether the mum developed before Yom Tov or on Yom Tov. Rabbi Yehuda, if the mum developed on Yom Tov, then even though royin mumin, but it was muksa prior to Yom Tov, now we're going to see whether Rab Shimon makes such a difference. Now, we know clearly Rab Shimon holds you're not allowed to give such a psak din. But what's going to happen also if a mumcha gave a psak din? Lit Rab Shimon. What do we do right now? Let's begin. Tanach Rabbanan. B'choir tam shenafal abord. Here it's clear. B'choir tam l'choir means that before Yom Tov it was completely tam. Rabbi Yehuda hanasi omer. And as we will see soon, we expect Rabbi Yehuda not to go against the Rab Shimon, the Rashbi. But let's go. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi Omer, he's so lenient. Not only is he more lenient than Rab Shimon, he's more lenient, right, than we have the record of Rabbi Yehuda. By the way, just to make it that Rabbi Yehuda is not the Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. Rab Shimon is Rabbi Yehuda bar Belelli. So he says, Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Rabbi Yehuda says, according to this version, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Yedid mumcha v'yira. Oh my God, that a mumcha can go down on Yom Tiv, and im yesh by mum, yala v'yishchait. Now that's huge. That's huge. Let's read the Tosfos. Tanach Rabbanan b'chor tam shenafal abord hacher gasinan. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, number one, leis le muktzah, obviously. Right, because if he would subscribe to Rabbi Yehuda's din of muktzah, no, the animal was tam before Yom Tov. And therefore, vafilu nafal bi Yom Tov, even if the mum came into the animal on Yom Tov, yala v'yishchait. And in other words, the point is, the leis lohu lahani tanoi muktzah b'b'choir, de lo oilam datei olav. A bechor, it's not bechlal, he doesn't paskin like Rabbi Yehuda, but since the owner of a bechor, the kohen, knows that the moment there'll be a mum, I will be able to do with the animal as I see fit, so the owner never takes his mind off the animal, because the owner thinks, Shema yipol by mum. Wow. So now we're learning up a third shita. It's very lenient. It's lenient that you can paskin, like Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah, but it's more lenient than the Rabbi Yehuda, as we just clarified before the two dots. Let Rabbi Yehuda, the mum that you can paskin has to be a mum that is the way it is now before Yom Tov. So the mumcha is just revealing that this blemish that already was in the animal out of Yom Tov was already a blemish. And by the way, we're going to learn a lot more about this on next daf. About do you view the psak din as something mikano lahaba, or does the psak din go back lemafreya? It's very negeya that. Obviously, according to Rabbi Yehuda, it has to go back lemafreya, because you have to say that already from before Yom Tov it wasn't muksa. Rabbi Yehuda completely ignores this. And the way Tosfos explains, because it's not that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rebbe, it's not that Rebbe doesn't hold of the din of muktzah, but he holds that by a bechor, the owner always has in mind, you never know, it might be blemished. But v'im lav lo yishchait, what does that mean? That even if you brought it out of the pit, that's the key, even if you brought it out of the pit, and now there is a mum, Rebbe just said that even if the mum comes into the animal on Yom Tov, you're good. Here, we're going to penalize you. That's the way Rashi teaches this line. Since you were not allowed to bring it up as a knas, you can't have it. That's the imlav lo yishchot. Omaloi Rab Shimon ben Menasya challenging Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. I don't understand. Harei Omru ein royin mumin b'yom tev. In other words, the way Rashi teaches, we're going to go all the way down in Rashi, 5 lines before the bottom of the Amid, the last relatively narrow line. Rab Shimon ben Menasya is saying that already to Rabbeinu Hanasi, the Tanoim from the generation before you, referring to Rab Shimon. Stam Rab Shimon is Rab Shimon bar Yochai already, and he says that Rebbe was a Talmud of Rab Shimon bar Yochai. Rashi says that's why he's not excited. How can you go against your teacher? How can you go against Rab Shimon? You're saying you can paskin such a din Torah on Yom Tov? No, you may not. Ein roin mum b'Yom Tov. Now, Ketzad, you see that Rab Shimon ben Menasya is adopting the Shita of Rab Shimon. And we will learn what the Beitzah is saying, even though, again, guys, at the end, we're going to refute all this. We're going to say the whole Beitzah is not authoritative. But now we're going to learn a nuance in Rab Shimon that we didn't see yet in the Mishnah. So Ketzad, so Rab Shimon ben Menasya, that's siding with Rab Shimon, is saying like this. What happens? If the blemish came into the animal erev Yom Tov, which is the case of the Mishnah, then ein mevakrin oiso, you may not look at it, you may not examine it, because Rab Shimon holds ein royin mumin. However, you have to be medayek in the lashon of the Beitzah. Look inside the last line in Rashi. What Rab Shimon ben Menasya is trying to say, Bishitas Rab Shimon, if you did examine it, since the mum was in the animal from before Yom Tov, then you are allowed to shecht it. This different.
Rabbi, but if I know that there is a mum before Yom Tov, what do I care about Yom Tov?
Fantastic. Happy asking that question. So, Yakir, nowadays, let's say from Maris, for example, there's a special smicha that you have to receive to specialize in that field. When in those days there was a special smicha program that a person to paskin, whether the animal is considered blemished or not, they needed to get smicha. And that psak din, we're going to learn about this more, God's willing, on Daf Chav Zayin. That psak din, according to Rab Shimon, is considered a financial psak din. I'll tell you, I'll go a step further. I'll give you a heads up.
For training purposes, as they say in Lashon Medina.
No. For what?
Training?
No, not for training purposes. Before the Rav Paskins, you are not allowed to paskin on your own. Let me ask you.
But I know it before Yom Tov.
No. You know that the lip is split. But whether the halachically this is called a permanent blemish or not, you need to have a Rav that paskins. And by the way, even if you know the din, if you did not get smicha, you don't have the right to give such a psak din.
Got it.
Okay. So here, mitamol says a nuance that even according to Rab Shimon that says ein royin. Yeah, if the moon was from before Yom Tov, if the Rav went against the rule and was mevaked it, then you can eat it. But noilad loy boom be Yom Tov daf chavav amid beis. Here, guys, we're reading the Mishnah with Rashi, the Beitzah exactly the way it means. Just the whole Beitzah is not authoritative. Rab Shimon Omer, ein zemen amuchen. Ein zemen amuchen means, look inside Rashi in the place of Tosfos, in the top right. Im noil by mum b'Yom Tov, bezu hoyer Rab Shimon bar Yochai Omer, ein zemen amuchen, meaning, v'afilu avaru bikroi lo yishchait. Because since the mum only came into the animal on Yom Tov, we view this psak din, the psak din, Yakir, the Rav psak is an act of tikkun. That's an interesting thing. What's if the mum was in the animal from before Yom Tov, even though the kohen was not allowed to eat it before psak din of a Rav, but the psak din of a Rav is not considered as mamash an act of tikkun. But if the mum erst came to the animal on Yom Tov and the Rav paskind, you mamash fixed it from asur to mutter, then even b'di'evid, you can't have it. The shavin, now this goes back to the Mishnah. What's Rabbi Yehuda b'chlal is lenient. The Rabbi Yehuda b'Rabbi Eloi, not Rabbi Yehuda Anasi. That what? In the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda holds mevakrin royin mumen. So Vishavin means both Rab Yehuda of the Mishnah and Rab Shimon agree she'im noilad hu umumay imay, that if when the animal was born, it was right away born with a blemish, that's called min hamuchan. Now let me again give you a heads up. This is so beautiful. You know what? You know when we say, not everyone, but let's say Rab Shimon says that certain things may not be ruled, you can't paskin on Yom Tiv if prior to the Psak Din it was Asr. And your Psak Din is making it mutter. I'm speaking financial. Before the Psak Din, it's not yours, it's a carbon, it's a bechar. Now I'm paskening that it belongs to you. That is changing the status that you may not adjudicate on Yom Tiv, or like Rashi writes over here, you're masakin, it's an act of tikkun. But if an animal, a bechar, let's remember, we learned Masechtas Bechairas, while the animal is in the fetus, while the animal is in the womb of the mother, there is zero kedusha. Remember the dinim that when you shech the mother, ben pekua, then you can have everything that's in the mother. You can even have the animal that's inside the mother. If there's a female kosher animal that is pregnant for the first time, and you shech the mother, and then when you open up the mother, the baby is male. Zero kedushas bechar. The kedusha of the bechar is only imbued in the animal when it leaves the womb of the mother. In other words, when this animal is in the mother, it's not asr. It's not even a suffix. It's mutter. So if the animal is born and as it comes into the world, as the Gemara will say in a few moments, you had a Rav there who had the smicha, a mumcha. He was authorized to give such a psak din, and he saw right away that this is a blemish. That ruling is not called changing of the status. The animal was never ushered. Now that it was mutter, he never allowed it to become ushered. That's allowed. That's the meaning of this line. The big thing here is that when we learned the Mishnah, Rab Shimon says ein royin. Now, what happens if yes royin? We didn't know in the Mishnah whether we penalize, whether we don't penalize. What happens is there a difference between a mum that noilad loy me'erev Yom Tov to noilad that for sure we didn't see in the Mishnah. That's a big chiddush here in the Brais. So when we learned this Brais, there was a machlokes amoraim how to understand Rab Shimon in the Brais. So Dorish Rabba Barafuna. Right, this is the case. This is a case where the b'chayr is born with a blemish. Noiled hu umumay imay. In that case, the pshat v'shavin, even Rab Shimon that says ein royin, that mevakrin oiser b'yom tov lechatchila. You can, like we said, if a rav is there when the mother gives birth, lechatchila he can say, this is blemished. However, Amalei Rav Nachman, he challenges Rabba Barafun and he says, Abba, my father, when he learned this Braisa, he had a different girsa. He learned by the Veshavin, by the third clause, that im avaru bikroi, that if wrongfully they paskent, mevukar. Like we explained, because it's not really a change of status, because the animal was never ushered for the Rav to be matirit. So I clearly had a version in this Braisa, that in the Veshavin case, it's only a b'di'evid, va'at omrat mevakrin oisel lachatchila. So Abaye will now read this Braisa again and prove that Rabba Barafuna is right. The way the Braisa is worded, Rabba Barafuna is correct in saying dafka what he said. For there to be a flow, if not the Braisa doesn't flow. That the Veshavin is that Rab Shimon is moida you can lechatchila paskin. Because me diktani tlos above the Braisa, the way we have it, has three stanzas. I'm not talking about the Tanach Rab Yehuda Hanasi. I'm saying after Rab Shimon ben Menasya tells Rab Yehuda Hanasi, you Rebbe, you are a Talmud of Rab Shimon bar Yochai, you can't ignore your teacher who says ein mevakrin. But then he went ahead and he gave three cases, the Braisa. If noilad mum me'erev Yom Tov, next case was noilad mum bi Yom Tov, and the next case was the Veshavin. And in order for each case to be different than the other, it has to be the way Rabba Barafuna teached it to be. Number one is noilad mum me'erev Yom Tov. This is all the version of the Braisa that Rab Shimon holds ein mevakrin oiseh bi Yom Tov. We knew that when we learned the Mishnah. But what we did not know from the Mishnah is the inference that we make from the words of the Braisa, as we read the last line in Rashi and Amud Aleph. What the Braisa really means to say is that if the mum was noilad in the animal from Erev Yom Tov, even though Rab Shimon holds ein mevakrin, ein royin, but ein royin lachatchila. Lechatchilu hu doloi. But it really implies that hadi evet shaper dami. And we don't penalize. And since the mum was in the animal from Erev Yom Tov, even Rab Shimon will hold that you can eat it. You can shecht it. No, you shouldn't have looked. Once you have the psak din, now the kohen can shecht it. Then the case number 2 on the Beitzah was Noilel b'Yom Tov. In order for this to have another ruling, it's worse. Like Rashi says, that's misaknoi lagamri, because here it's not menamuchin at all, even according to Rab Shimon. Rab Shimon, I mean, ein ze menamuchan, meaning for this to be different than the first case, ta'afilu di'evet namiloi. So first case is b'di'evet. Second case is that l'chumra, not even b'di'evet. The third clause, for it to be a different din, it has to be here even l'chatchila. Because if the third case of a shavin is only b'di'evet, then the third case and the first case is the same din. Don't do it, but if you did it, it's okay. So why did we separate it? And it must be, again, for this not to be the same as case number 1, and the Gemara is not going to challenge Abaye's understanding of this Beitzah. Taka, that's the way the Beitzah says it. But this whole Beitzah is not going to be authoritative. And you should remember as a klal that Rab Oishia and Abchia, they were the two upon whom we consider all of the works of the Tanoim that were not incorporated in the Mishnah by Rabbeinu HaKadosh. They were the ones through whom whatever they said, all of their Beitzahs is perfect. And if it was not learned by Rabbi Oishia and Abchia, we have a question mark. And if there's a stira, even if it's a stira from inference between what Rabbi Oishia teaches and another Beitzah, we're going to always side with that which Rabbi Oishia taught. Says the Gemara, Abaya, you're wrong. You're right in the Beitzah. Rabbi Barafuna is right in the understanding of this Beitzah, but we're going to reject the whole Beitzah again as not being, as it got corrupted. When Rabbi Oishia came to Bavel, he came and he taught the following words. Clearly, Bein shenoilad boy mu me'erev Yom Tov. Bein shenoilad boy mu me'Yom Tov. Chachamim oimrim, this is so important for next daf. Rab Shimon. It's interesting that in the Beitzah of Rav Oishia, we quote what we know to be the shita of Rab Shimon in the name of the Chachamim, which means that this Beitzah is paskening like Rab Shimon, that one may not examine blemishes of a Bechor on Yom Tov. It became Das Rabim. The Chachamim holds Ein Ze Min HaMuchan. And you know what that means? It means that not only may you not examine it, but even if the Mumcha did examine it, we don't allow you to shecht it. Because you were not allowed to, and by the way, that's the way we learned the Mishnah. Rab Shimon holds you can't do it in the Kudah. No difference was made. L'chatchila, whether b'di'evet, all of that nuance was only Rabbi Yehuda and the Reish. Means Abaya was right in understanding that the Beitzah that we had on the bottom of the Amid, on Aleph, on top of Amid Beis, did give 3 clauses. Mashma that Rab Shimon does make such a difference. So the Gemara says, I even know who taught us this Tanah Rabbanan that we began on Daf Chavav and Amid Aleph in the bottom. And it was taught by Ade Bar Ukmei. Look, we have his name. And the Mishabish V'Tanei. And as a rule, when he taught, he was not medayik in the words. He was not medayik. We're not saying mishabish in a negative way that everything he said is a mistake. But when he taught Beitzahs, it's common that the choice of organization was not ideal. So the whole diuk is because he made 3 clauses, and if the v'shavin only means b'di'evet, then the third case and the first. No, we don't accept any of that. Well, you know what we accept? That's Nakuda. That the Chachamim hold, which is Rab Shimon, that since Ein Mevakrin or Ein Royin Mumin on Yom Tov, it makes no difference whether the Mum was noiled before Yom Tov, whether the Mum was noiled on Yom Tov, Ein Mevakrin, and B'di'evet, if the Rav Paskin that it's a Mum, you may not shecht it on Yom Tov. Umitzat Sheni, just to know, Umitzat Sheni, this concept that if noiled hu umumay imay, which is what's introduced not by the Beitzah of Rab Oishia, which is introduced in the Beitzah above. We're going to say, okay, then we can. It's still subject to the Machlokes Amoraim. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Masnisin Namidaika. Our Mishnah, if you really look into it, you're going to see that the version of Rab Oishia's Braisa, expounding Shitas Rab Shimon, whom he calls the Chachamim, is correct, and dafka not the way we have it in this Braisa that now we know was brought to us by Adam bar Ukmei. The Tani, it says in our Mishnah, Rab Shimon oimel kol she'ein mumar nikar me'erev yomtev ein min hamuchan. What does he mean, ein mumay nikar? Now the literal translation is that we did not recognize the mum. Does it mean ein mumay nikar klal? Ein mumay nikar klal means not that we did not recognize it, that it did not have a blemish. If it didn't even have a blemish, which is the worst case scenario, like Rashi says on top over here in this Amid, that then the psak din is a kemesaknoi lagamrei, then tzricha pshita tzricha lameimer. Of course, then you may not make an examination. It must be ein mumay nikar means there was a blemish. But you were saying, Yakir, the balabas knew it was blemished, but you didn't have the ruling of the expert, and you have to have the ruling of the expert. Whether that mum is called mum kavua, which would make that animal permissible for a kohen to consume, or if maybe it's called a mum that's not permanent. And nevertheless, the Mishnah writes the words, Tanemias, ein zeh min hamuchan, ein zeh min hamuchan. So shma mina, that Rab Shimon does not differentiate when the mum came to the animal. In either case, if the mumcha violated the rule, l'shitas Rab Shimon, and he was roya, and he paskin that it's a mum kavua, no matter whether it was before, whether it was later, that animal may not be slaughtered l'shitas Rab Yehuda, l'shitas Rab Shimon, l'shitas Rab Shimon, gavaldik. Okay, at least we simplified shitas Rab Shimon without making that differentiation. And now we're going to take a step away from the din of a Bukhar. We're going to ask a very general question, and as you'll see in a moment, that it is linked, it's connected to our topic. The big step back is like we spoke about in the introduction. When an animal, when an item is muktzah during bein hashmashes, during twilight, that's called migu de iskatsoy lebein hashmashes. Certainly l'shitas Rab Yehuda, that's shitas Rab Yehuda, iskatsoy for the entire Shabbos. Even in shitas Rab Yehuda, who has a broader application of muktzah, the question will be, what happens if there is something that was not muktzah by twilight coming into Shabbos or coming into Yom Tov? When Shabbos and Yom Tov entered, it was not muktzah. During Shabbos or during Yom Tov, for a period of time, it became muktzah. We'll see, we'll give examples in a moment. I'll give you the example that the Gemara will give in the beginning. It was common for people to put raisins or figs on the roof to dry out. Now before you put the grape on the roof, it's edible. Once it begins to dry out, it became inedible until the drying process ended. I'll give you an example. So it was common that when you put things on the roof to dry out, if it began to dry before Shabbos and Yom Tov, that would be a classical case where we would say that even if it's fully, properly edible, dried out during Shabbos, too late. But what happens if, for example, it got dried out before Shabbos? But Shabbos morning it rained, it drizzled, and it became moist again, and it's inedible. And then Shabbos afternoon, the sun dried it out again. That is our question. It's called muktzah lachatzi Shabbos or ein muktzah lachatzi Shabbos. Let's read it inside. And this question was asked, boy minei, our version, let's just go with the Bach, is Rav Hillel asked the question from Rabbah. What's the question? Yesh muktzah lachatzi Shabbos. Do we say that since for any time during Shabbos or Yom Tov, it's the same thing, it was muktzah, it remains that way for the rest of Shabbos and Yom Tov, or no, ein muktzah lachatzi Shabbos? And the Gemara clarifies as we spoke out. Hey chidami, where is the case of this inquiry? If it was already fit bein hashmashos, for example, you put up the raisins, you put up the grapes, you put up the figs to dry, and it became fully dried from before Shabbos and Yom Tov, then it was never muktzah at all. Then echazi. Then, anytime you want during Shabbos and Yom Tov, go to the roof and go take it and go enjoy it. If it was not fit while Shabbos or Yom Tov entered, in other words, it was still in the process of being ready during Bein HaShmashes, then lo yichazi, in other words, for sure we know already, let Rabbi Yehuda, migudis katzoi lebein HaShmashes, it's katzoi for the whole day. Lo yitzricha, the case of the Mishnah is, the case of the inquiry is, the yichazi. So let's go to the same case. It was fully dried out before the Bein HaShmashes of Shabbos and or of Yom Tov. However, v'hadi itche, but then let's say it drizzled on it, and while it was moist, it was inedible, and v'hadi rechazi, and then towards the latter part of Shabbos, it dried out again. Mai, do we say that since it was muksa a little bit, it remains for the rest, or not? So Amarlei, I know that we said the Bach Rabba, let's just not to get confused, people are going to look, let's quote the Girsa in the Gemara. So Rabba responds, yes, l'chumra, yes, yesh muksa. Finished. And now we're going to have a series of challenges against Rav or against Rabba, and we're going to finish as much as we could now, and we'll continue this topic on Daf Chav Zayin. So let's go to challenge number 1. So Eisvei, now you'll see Maha Shaychus between this topic of Yesh Muktzah Lachatzi, Ein Muktzah Lachatzi to our topic of Bechor, because the first attempt, refutation of Rabba or Rabba is from the Beitzah that we just quoted. Even though we said that it's corrupted, but we're going to go back to that Beitzah. Eisvei, we learned as the third clause, right, the top line of the Amid, Vishavin, as we explained. This Vishavin refers to Rabbi Yehuda of the Mishnah, Rab Shimon of the Mishnah, that what? She'im noilad umumai imai, that if it was born already with a blemish, shezeh min hamuchan, enoch. According to Rabba Barafuna's interpretation, lachatchila, you can be mavaked it, and if it's determined that it's blemished, if he says it's blemished, you can shecht it and eat it. Hold on, why? Neima, why don't we say, Hi Bechor, this animal, this Bechor, meikara means, as we spoke out, while it was in the mother's womb, and this is an animal that was in the mother's womb during Bein HaShmashes, hava chazi agavime, like we spoke out. There's no machlokes about that. There is no kedushas bechor while this male is in a fetus state in the mother's womb. It was roy. So let's go in the case where it was born. Isyalid lay. The moment it's born, in other words, the kasha is based on the premise that when a male offspring is born, we have to give it the chazaka that it's a bechor. We have to give it such a chazaka. Until you hear from a mumcha, otherwise that's the kasha. So then itchalei becheskas bechor tam, you may not shecht it. Now that the chacham sees it, vishavin, that you're good. There was a moment until he gave that psak din that it's becheskas bechor, that it's aser. Yeah, but now that you paskin that it's blemished, it goes back to being permissible. So ishtaralei, that's a raya ein muksa. So Amar Abaye or Vitemer Rab Safra, the case of the Beitzah must be Kigoin Diyasvi Dayanei Hasam. The Dayanim were sitting, witnessing the birth, and therefore it was never Becheskas Bechor Tam, as the animal is emerging. So the people that are qualified to pass can say, "Ooh, look at that blemish." So there was never a moment where the animal was becheskas isur, which is taka why Rabba Barafuna understands that mevakran oisoi lichatchila afilu l'Rab Shimon, like we explained, because you're not changing his status. Ikeda Amri, others opine that Rabba or Rava responded to the boya of Rav Hillel by saying the opposite, and by the way, we paskin according to this version that ein muktzah lachatzi Shabbos. Bein HaShmashes is different, but if Bein HaShmashes it's not muktzah, then it's muktzah only during the time that it's muktzah, and then it's no longer muktzah. And they attempted to bring our sugya as a siyua to the psak din of ein muktzah lachatzi Shabbos. And le'me misayele, it's the same thing. That v'shavin she'im noilo demuma imoy shezamen amuchan. Now, v'ha b'chor meikara, as we mentioned, hava chazi agavimi. While the animal was still in the mother's womb, if one were to shech the animal ben pekua, one would be allowed to take the b'chor and eat it. Has no kedushas b'chor at all. Isyaled lei, the moment it's born, l'cha'oir again, itchalei, it's no longer allowed to be given to the kohen. Why? Because b'cheskas b'chor tam. Now that they're paskening, echazei lei, When the Chacham saw and determined that it's blemished, then ishtirele. So it's araya taka that ain muksa lachatzi Shabbos, and the same Amar Abaya or V'temer Rab Safra. You can't prove it from this Beitzah because maybe the case is the Yasvei Dayon Hasem, and therefore it was never bechaskas tam from the outset. It was already rendered to be a bechor that is blemished. Okay, Tashema. Whichever girsa was said by Rava or Rabba, yesh muksa or ein muksa, l'chayra, let's see what this Beitzah will hold. Tashema, just an example. Person is eating grapes and there's leftover grapes, and therefore vehelon legag lasos mehem tzemukim, and he put them on the roof to make them into raisins. Similarly, same case, bita einem, you're eating figs, and it's food that you definitely had in mind to eat. You were actually eating from it. But after you realized that you're not going to eat all of it up, kedai, to dry it out, you brought it up on the roof to make from them groigeres, dried figs. So says the Beitzah, lo yoichal mehen, you may not eat from it, unless means prior to Shabbos or prior to Yom Tov, you specifically said, you designated that which is on my roof, I will eat on Shabbos and on Yom Tov. And that's not only when it comes to Anovim, not only when it comes to Te'enim, these are only examples. As the Beitzah writes, Befedish, V'chein Atamoitze, if you were eating a farsikin, if you were eating peaches, or Uva Chavush and quince, or Ubeshar Minei Peiros. And now the Gemara wants to understand what exactly is going on over here. What's the case of this Beitzah? Clearly, we're saying, Achiyazmi mi bo'od yoim. So if you put them on the roof to dry and they fully got dried out again before Shabbos, so lamali azmana. You don't need to have azmana. Food, it's food, edible food. It's automatically muzan. And if it was not fit, it means you put it on the roof before Shabbos, but as Shabbos came in, it was not fit. Ki azmin lohu mayave. How does that help? During Bein Hashmoshes, it was unfit. And v'chitema, that may be the case of the Beitzah is the lo yadi I chazi. This is a very good chap. Maybe again, a person is eating foods. He decides to put the leftovers on the roof. You don't want to go before Bein Hashmoshes on your roof because you're lazy to check and see where exactly is it at. You don't know. You know that if it's not dry, you may not eat it. But you don't know. You want to make one thing clear. I'm making a declaration that if it's fit, I want to eat it. If that is the case of the Beitzah, the Ha'amar Rav Kahana, that such a statement need not even be made. Because Rav Kahana already said that muktzah, something that was set aside here to be dried out, sheyavesh, and it was taka fully dried out, therefore edible, therefore food, before Bein Hashmoshes. But the Eina Bala Makirim, you were unaware of it. Rav Kahana paskint that we don't need for you to be aware. Since when you put it on the roof, you knew that at some point it will become dried out. If it's dried out before Shabbos and Yom Tov, it's mutter. So you don't have to make a hazmana. So again, what's the case of the Beitzah? Elolav, what happened was, the chazu v'itchu v'hadari chazu. The case must have been that it was fit before Shabbos. Bein Hashmoshes, it was fit. But sometime during Shabbos and Yom Tov, it became unfit, and now it's fit again. Okay? So there we say that since you made a hazmana, you are allowed to eat it when it's fit. Now, ve'i amrat, that if it's unfit during a certain period during Shabbos, it has no effect. It does not render it permanently muksa for that Shabbos. Again, why do you need to have hazmana? So that's a raya that yesh muktzah, and therefore it's going to be a kasha on the version that says that the Rav or Rabba said ein muktzah. So the Gemara says no. What Ella, my guys, the medium size, 3 lines from the bottom. Okay, so you're telling me that yesh muktzah? So therefore, if you subscribe to yesh muktzah, how does Azmani even resolve anything? Ki azmin lohu may have. There's no such a thing. So therefore, it must be that the case of the Beitzah is not connected to our question of yesh muktzah lachatzi Shabbos or not. It's a unique case. You know what happened? Tzricha was the ichazu v'lo ichazu. You have fruit that you put out to dry before Shabbos, before Yom Tov. When Bein Hashmoshes came in, it was marginally fit. Some people would eat, some people wouldn't eat. So on that is where Hazmana makes all the difference. That is where we say that if the person specifically says, I'm going to eat of it even the way it is right now. Galidati, that he's not bothered by the fact that it's not fully dried out. Loy Asman, if he makes not such a declaration, since loy galidate, we have to lean on the side of stringency. But this is completely not related to our shaila. If something takas muksa during Shabbos, whether yesh muksa or ein muksa. So again, whichever version we have of Rabba or Rava's response, so far nothing is yet proven from the works of Tanaim. I think we're going to leave it over here. And it's very important that a lot of Daf Chav Zayin, not only are we going to take off to resolve the yesh or ein muksa lachatzi Shabbos, but we're going to come back to the bigger topic of Bukhar, and we're going to further appreciate better. I just want to speak to what you cared. You were bothered that when you have a halachic question, whether something is a blemished or not blemished, or treif, is it treif or not treif? And we mention that one may not adjudicate financial dinei Torah on Shabbos nor on Yom Tov. Yeah, that cannot be done. But Isser v'heter is done ma'asim b'chol yom. You have a shaila, you can't ask a Rav a shaila. But you have to understand that when you ask a shaila, as we'll see in the next daf, at least many people understand it that way, when you ask a Rav a question whether something is treif or not, he is not conferring the status of treif. He's not making it treif. He's only revealing what it is. And if that siman of treif was already in the animal from before, he's not making it unfit, or he's not making it fit, it's retroactive. And as we will see, at least perhaps, that the question of whether the animal is blemished or not, even though, it's a metzias, is it blemished or is it not blemished? Until the mumcha, until the Rav who's qualified, who was given smicha, until he paskins that this is blemished, it's not blemished. And his psak din confers in it. It creates the heter. And not only that, it only creates the heter mikano lahabo. I'm just explaining more and more the appreciation of the shita of Rab Shimon that holds that ein rayin mumen b'yam tov chevra, a lot more to be continued.